Shalom Aleichem. I'm Susan Bronson. I'm the Yiddish Book Center's president, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you for joining us, whether in person or one of the many people around the world joining us online for our live stream. I want to welcome you to this year's Melinda Rosenblatt lecture. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Please turn off your cell phones and note that recording is not permitted. The lecture is being recorded, so if you want to hear it again or send your friends to it, it'll be on our website very soon. For those in the audience who are joining us via live stream, your video and audio will be muted throughout, and you can submit questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Please refrain from comments and try to keep your questions short. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible after the lecture. I want to thank Leif Rosenblatt, our board chair emeritus, for making this annual lecture possible in honor of his late wife, Melinda Rosenblatt. It's always a very special event, and this year we're particularly honored to welcome Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett to the Yiddish Book Center. Barbara is Professor Emerita at New York University and Ronald S. Lauder, Chief Curator of the Core Exhibition at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Her books include Image Before My Eyes, a photographic history of Jewish life in Poland, 1864 to 1939. They Called Me May or July, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust, and Anne Frank Unbound, Media, Imagination, Memory. Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett was awarded the 2021 Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Folklore Society. She was by the Foundation for Jewish Culture and has received honorary doctorates from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, University of Haifa, and Indiana University. She received the 2015 Marshall Sklar Award for her contribution to the social scientific study of Jewry and was decorated with the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. It's a mouthful. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and awarded the Dan David Prize. She serves on advisory boards for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Council of American Jewish Museums, Jewish Museum Vienna, and Jewish Museum Berlin. She also advises on museum and exhibition projects around the world. It's really a privilege to have Barbara with us here today to talk about what it means to put Yiddish on display and how the question of exhibits like our own Yiddish, a Global Culture, change our understanding of Jewish history and shape the way we understand Yiddish as a language and a culture. And there really is no one better to help us consider these questions. I can't tell you how personally thrilled I am that Barbara agreed to join us today. She is truly a force, and I can't wait to hear her talk, and I won't keep you any longer. Let me bring Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett to the stage.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction. I especially want to thank Susan and Lisa Newman and David Mazover for making it possible for me to be here today. I have been a great fan of the Yiddish Book Center since its very, very beginning, and I was so eager to see this wonderful new permanent exhibition. And so the opportunity to come here today was really very, very special. So I think that you can see that I am at home here. I am definitely at home. I have found my happy place here at the Yiddish Book Center. When I'm not in my own library, this is taken some years ago on the Bowery, this is the place for me. And I'm intrigued by the evolution of the Yiddish Book Center from a mission of rescue. In a sense, this is both a poignant image, but also it's the beginning of a very big story. It's a poignant image because these, if you will, this is a collection of orphans. Books that have been orphaned because their readers are no more. They are the libraries of people who once read these books, understood them, treasured them, and with their passing, these books lost their home, lost their readers. And so this institution, the Yiddish Book Center, not only reclaimed the books, but also has been making an extraordinary effort to reclaim the readers by creating new generations of Yiddish readers for these books. And so for many, many years, these books were on these shelves, and these rows of shelves are for me really fascinating because on the one hand, looks like a library, but not quite. It's really more like a depot. And of course, now I understand that there is a depot. This is part of it. There are also books in storage. But it's the only place where, I mean, it's the only, if you will, library where you might have 15 copies of the same book, but no one to take them out. And so it's a very, very, when I see this set of show bookcases, I'm really, and this of course is from much earlier, but it's the transformation of this depot, this open stack depot, into this extraordinary exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture. And I had the wonderful experience of visiting this exhibition yesterday and again today, but with David Mazover, who created it. And I would say that it's a must-see, and it's very extraordinary. And there is a claim that is made on an opening panel in the lobby that is worth reading. And the claim, as you can see here, that the claim is this, that this exhibition is the first ever museum-level exploration of the modern Yiddish story. It's true. It's the first time. Now, it's not that there haven't been exhibitions of Jewish books or Yiddish books, Yiddish children's books, Yiddish literature, and also the beautiful graphic treatment of the covers of Yiddish books. There have been. But there has never really been a major, and in this instance, what you'd call a core exhibition or a permanent exhibition, dedicated not only to the Yiddish book, but to Yiddish as a language, as a culture, but with the collection of books in this institution as a starting point. But in essence, what's happened is that those rows of books, that open stack depot, those books have been opened, and a kind of vista onto their writers and their readers and the world that they created blossoms, just opens up in this exhibition. Now, what I love about this exhibition, among other things, is that it has one big message, and that is that Yiddish is global. Yiddish language and Yiddish culture are global. And this message is communicated beautifully throughout the exhibition. No matter what the topic, you will discover what it looked like in New York, in Buenos Aires, in Tel Aviv, wherever Yiddish-speaking Jews went, they took their world with them. And in that sense, Yiddish is global. It is everywhere. But what I think is really very, very interesting in the exhibition is the section on translation. Because the section on translation makes a different kind of global claim, and that is that Yiddish language and culture are also international, because you see all of the world literature translated into Yiddish. In other words, what were Yiddish readers reading? Not only what was written in Yiddish for them, but also world literature translated into Yiddish. So global, international, in the sense that Yiddish and Yiddish speakers and Yiddish readers and Yiddish culture occupy a global and also international, not quite the same thing, space. Now, when I saw this section of the exhibition, my eye caught this image on the left, and the image on the left is Paris, and it's a very interesting story because I think this is the precursor to this exhibition. So, what is it? Well, the image on the left is a Wegweiser, is a guidebook in Yiddish to Paris. It means it's the Arc de Triomphe and it's the Champs-Élysées and it's the Eiffel Tower, everything in Yiddish, with the assumption that there are 100, at least this is what's declared, that there's 100,000 Yiddish speakers in Paris, because the 1920s and 30s is the period of mass immigration to Paris and to Western Europe from Eastern Europe. It's 1937. And that there will be 15,000 Yiddish-speaking tourists in Paris because of the World's Fair, the 1937 Paris World's Fair. Now, at the 1937 Paris World's Fair, there were two pavilions. One, which became de rigueur at World's Fairs in the 20th century, was the so-called Palestine Pavilion, or the Pavilion of, in the case of the New York World's Fair, it was called, they were forced to change the name to the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. There were two pavilions. One was the Palestine Pavilion, but the other was something called the Modern Jewish Culture Pavilion, which was tucked into a building that was called the International, the sort of international building that had in it a kind of a ragtag, I would say, jumble of exhibits that couldn't be found anywhere, couldn't find a place anywhere else, and that included the Modern Jewish Culture Pavilion. Now, in the Yiddish press of the time, in Paris, there was a debate as to whether Modern Jewish Culture Pavilion was the right word for this pavilion, because, in fact, it was a modern Yiddish culture pavilion. And so there was a debate, because if you say it's Jewish, then what happens to Hebrew, and what happens to Jewish Palestine? But it was Yiddish. And the Naya Press, one of two Yiddish newspapers in Paris at the time, reported in the opening, here by the Trocadero, the Eiffel Tower, etc., is nestled within the enormous international pavilion, and we find a map, and these are a map of a country or a region. In the Jewish pavilion, you will find a world map. Now, what did this pavilion show? And I could find almost nothing, but Nick Underwood has written a very fascinating book about basically Yiddish Paris in the 20s and 30s, and he has a whole chapter devoted just to this pavilion. And all we have so far are 4 postcards. They're in the archive, in the YIVO archive, and these 4 postcards, in fact, are snapshots of sections of the walls of this exhibition. And they're essentially infographics. And you can imagine, they did have some objects, and they had a shelf of books, but it was very, very modest. But in concept, it is in a way I think of it as anticipating this incredible exhibition. So what you see, and essentially, this particular exhibition, like the one here, left no Yiddish stone unturned. And so it had, for example, showing this was really Yiddish land, showing all the places where Yiddish-speaking Jews had moved. Then literature in the 19th century, and then a kind of demographic infographic on the number of Jews speaking Yiddish. This is where these numbers come from. Now, also, Nachum Meisel was quoted in the Neue Presse, "Culture in the current moment is not just a book or a school. Most importantly, it is a battle for the right to exist." Now, it turned out that World's Fairs were a great place to stage, if you will, to make declarations and make a statement. And the 19th century World's Fairs were predicated on the idea that the World's Fair was a way to measure progress. It was about the progress of civilization. But in the 20th century, World's Fairs were about the world of the future. And they were really about making an assertion about who are we and who do we want to become and where do we want to go. And this was particularly clear in the case of the New York World's Fair in 1939 and 40. If you can imagine, this was a fair that was mounted during World War II, and in 1940, the fair organizers demanded that the exhibitors come back and continue during the war to keep their exhibitions open, which is, absolutely unconceivable. And so they also had a Wegweiser, they also had a Yiddish guide, and it was a guide to the fair itself. And the publication that came with it was, of course, for the Palestine Pavilion. And interestingly, there was no modern Jewish culture, no modern Yiddish culture pavilion of any kind whatsoever. And the only other presence that Jews had at this fair was in the Temple of Religion. Now, how you cannot compare Paris in 1937 and New York in 1939. 2 completely different stories of immigration, and actually we see what that looks like here in this exhibition, as I think you will see when you visit it. So when thinking about Yiddish on display, I asked myself, are there museums of language? And if they are, what are they like? And what other languages have been displayed, and how have they been displayed? And it turns out that there are, at least 70, maybe more museums of language. Language has been recognized as intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. And so there's now much more attention to thinking about ways in which to exhibit language and also to advocate for them. But when it comes to Yiddish, I was trying to think to myself, where is Yiddish as a language, not simply literature or books or a much narrower view? And one of the few that I found, at least recently, was at YIVO. Eddie Portnoy exhibited a very wonderful small exhibition on Palestinian Yiddish, and this Arab Yiddish primer, so to speak, or a book for learning Arabic Yiddish, is here in the exhibition. I'm not sure if it's in the collection of the Yiddish Book Center or whether it's on loan, but it's actually here. But I want to turn to a completely different approach to presenting Yiddish in a major exhibition in a museum. And I want to take us now from Paris and from Amherst and from New York, and I want to take us to Warsaw. Now, I think maybe it would not be surprising that as the chief curator, at least at the time I was contracted to lead the development of the core exhibition, that in leading the development of the core exhibition, that for me, it was very important that Yiddish find its proper place in the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. So this is a completely different take. This is a completely different approach. And that is, there are, well, let me introduce you to the museum and then to the exhibition and then to how does Yiddish find its place, not only in space as a global language and culture, but also in history and in the history of Polish Jews, not only in the history of the Yiddish language, history of Yiddish literature, but in the history, in this case, of Polish Jews. So first of all, this is the site where POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews stands today. It stands on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, the rubble that was left after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, and simply reduced the entire ghetto, which had been the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, the largest Jewish community in Europe, and simply reduced the whole area to rubble. So we began, in a way, we began with nothing. We began no building, no collection, but we had this story. And so in 1948, on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there was the unveiling of the Monument of the Ghetto Heroes, which had been created by Natan Rappaport. And in the years that followed, this area was cleared of rubble. There were communist-era apartment buildings and a plaza and a meadow. And for virtually almost, I would say, at least 70 years, maybe longer, nothing in this area was left to tell you that anything had happened here, let alone the community that had lived here, nothing except this monument. And so the Museum of the History of Polish Jews was, in a sense, the first idea came in 1993. We opened our grand opening of our core exhibition in 2014. And I want to take you to the core exhibition, and I want to show you how we display Yiddish, how, in a sense, Yiddish displays itself as part of the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. So this is the interior of the museum. We come down a set of stairs, a kind of grand staircase, and we come into an area that is a kind of what we think of as a priming experience, which is a forest. And this forest is inspired by a legend. And this legend, we know this legend from Hebrew sources, and we also know it from Yiddish sources. And I have to say that the digitized collection that the Yiddish Book Center has made available was, for me, an extraordinary tool all the way through the process of creating this exhibition. So here from Gershom Bader, 30 Teures Jiden in Polen, And this is a text that I was able to retrieve from the digital collection here, and that is, it's the story of why we call POLIN Museum POLIN, and it basically is a story of Jews fleeing from persecution in Western Europe, coming in an easterly direction, finding themselves in a forest, and in the forest, the story varies, but it might be that they heard birds chirping or they saw pages of the Gemara. However, this information came to them, and it said, "Go to Poland, for there you will find rest." The Jews set out for Poland, and when they reached it, the birds in the forest chirped to greet them, "Polin, Polin," and the travelers translated this into Hebrew as if the birds were saying, "Here you should lodge." Now, this is a very, very counterintuitive way of starting a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. And that is that we start with a story that Jews told themselves. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I turned everything off. I swear, I turned everything off. Okay. So now, oh, my God. Ah, my God, I'm sorry. Oh, I know. I turned off the sound, right? I just mute it. Okay. Sorry. I'm very, very sorry. Okay. Now, so it's a very counterintuitive way to begin a 1,000-year story. And it's counterintuitive because we begin with a story that Jews told themselves, and it's a very positive story. We didn't start with hate, we didn't start with anti-Semitism, and we don't end with genocide. And actually, this is very much in the DNA of the Yiddish Book Center as well. And so we start with this story, and I would have liked to have used the Bader Yiddish version. As it turns out, we use the Agnon version in Hebrew, which is very, very, very well known and very beautifully told. So we have the primary experience in the forest, and then we move into the first historical gallery. And I should just acknowledge that Sam Cassow's here, and he was one of our lead historians, and you'll be able to see some of his handiwork a little later in the presentation. So let's see here. I have to make sure that I can move it. Okay. So as we enter the medieval gallery, we cross a threshold between legend and history. And as we cross that threshold, we ask the question, when did Jews come to Poland? Why did they come? And how did a few traveling merchants, how did a few travelers who were arriving in the 10th century, the 11th century, the 12th century, how did from a few traveling merchants did a Jewish community, if you will, the Jewish population expand to as much, by some estimates, as 15,000 Jews, living in 100 different locations, 50 of them Jewish communities, in the course of 500 years. Virtually half of our 1,000-year story is in the first medieval gallery. And when we try to present that period of settlement and the creating of towns across the territory, one of the questions we ask is, what did they bring with them? And they brought with them, of course, Yiddish language, Ashkenazi culture, and for us, one of the most beautiful, most wonderful expressions of that is the machzer of worms, the worms machzer. So what we wanted to do was to somehow establish Yiddish as a, if you will, a language with a long history and a huge legacy, and as a kind of starting point for understanding the beginnings of Ashkenazi culture as it came from the Rhineland to this eastern territory. And so this particular machzer was in use in the community of Worms until the synagogue was destroyed on Kristallnacht, which is unbelievable. And the machzer itself has survived. It's a 2-volume parchment machzer, a festival prayer book from the 13th century. And what's extraordinary is the first, I would say, legible, complete Yiddish sentence. And where does it appear? It appears inside those big letters, and it's a blessing for the person who will carry the book to the synagogue, and it appears in the hollows of this large calligraphic Hebrew word at the top of the page, because we believe that it must have belonged to the cantor, who was old, and the book weighs a ton. It's manuscript, and it's huge, and it would have been too much for him to carry. So the person who would carry it for him to the synagogue, it's a blessing for that person. And here it is. And so blessed be the person who carries this machzer to the synagogue. Now, believe it or not, we're finding Yiddish in this territory in the medieval period. And in this particular case, we have essentially, it's an oath that was taken by Yekutiel. A Jew from Poland was for many years in a dispute with the Wrocław town council about the reimbursement of money. And in 1435, he described himself as a subject of the Polish king. I, Jew Yekutiel, swore by my Jewish law before the king of Poland, my ruler, and the affidavit was written in Yiddish. And so this is really earlier, and it's in this territory. You'd expect it early in the Rhineland, but it's here. And one of my favorites, I really wish we had been able to get the original, but unfortunately, I wasn't even able to get a really good digital scan, but I couldn't believe this. This is an absolutely extraordinary manuscript by Isaac Bar Mordechai HaKohen, circa 1560, and it's associated with Krakow. And the manuscript really represents a kind of bridge between medieval and 18th century German manuscript illumination. So it's a liturgical manuscript, and it's virtually entirely in Yiddish, and it's considered one of the great Yiddish manuscript treasures of the world. Now, medieval gallery, 500 years, and I should tell you, the medieval historian was convinced, she complained, she said, nobody's going to go to the medieval gallery, it's too long ago. And she was convinced. But in fact, the medieval gallery, half our 1,000-year history, is also, I think, a really incredibly fascinating story. And we were able to find this kind of Yiddish presence and to, at least to present it, even if we couldn't present the original books, we did very much what you do here, and that is we presented it graphically. When we move from the medieval period to what we call the early modern period, which is 1569 to 1795, we come into the period when Poland was, or at least the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was the largest country in Europe, one of the most diverse in terms of culture, religion, language, including, of course, Yiddish, and it was an extraordinary period. And we've divided it into two parts. From 1569 until the mid-17th century and the Khmelnytsky uprising, and then from the mid-17th century to the end of this period, which would be 1795. Now, this map, to my way of thinking, is a really, really important moment in the exhibition. It shows you what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth looked like. It included Ukraine, Belarus, what is today Belarus, Lithuania, and much of Eastern Europe. But what's critical here is that the largest Jewish population in the world was living in this territory, 750,000 Jews. That's half of the world Jewish population by the mid-18th century is living in this territory, and they are Yiddish speakers. They are carriers of Ashkenazi Yiddish culture in this enormous territory. And what the message here is a different message. It's not necessarily, I mean, there is a global dimension to this message. There is an international dimension to this message, but there's also what I would call a co-territorial message, which is key to understanding the Yiddish language, which is to say that the Yiddish language always is a relational language. It always developed in relation to the languages around it. And Yiddish speakers were generally multilingual, to a greater or lesser extent. Yiddish, and in some way, shape, or form, Hebrew, and also the local language. And so you get a sense of the range of languages and cultures in which Yiddish and Yiddish speakers thrived. And there's a wonderful quote in this exhibition here, but it's also an insight that I've seen elsewhere, and that is that the minority knows more about the majority than the majority knows about the minority. And that is really an interesting way to be thinking about Yiddish speakers and their relationship to the wider society, and the wider society and its relationship to Yiddish speakers. Now, we wanted to communicate that this period was an extraordinary period for Jews living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that there were two markers of what made it so extraordinary. One was the rise of rabbinical authority, that the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world had by now shifted from the Rhineland east to here, and Jewish families in Western Europe were sending their sons to Poland specifically, and especially to Krakow, to study in the Polish yeshivas and in the Lithuanian yeshivas. How do you communicate this, if you will, the idea of that the center of Ashkenazi culture and the center of rabbinical authority has shifted? I'll say a word about that in a moment. And the second was that during this period in this territory, Jews enjoyed an astonishing degree of communal autonomy, of being able at the local level to run their own affairs, and also had a kind of supralocal council that was able to coordinate and integrate and help to govern this enormous Jewish population in all the various places where Jews had settled. But let me turn specifically to how do you communicate what happened, if you will, to Jewish culture in this period for it to have become a kind of center, if you will, of the Ashkenazi Jewish world. And we thought that books was the way to do it. And how do you make books interesting to visitors? Well, here in this incredible exhibition, I think that I was really struck. You would think that if you came here and there was an exhibition and there were a lot of books, that somebody would open up the book and you'd be looking at 2 pages of undecipherable type. That's the expectation. But that's not what you see. You see, to the degree that you see books, you see incredible covers and graphic art and all the ways in which those books wanted to attract their readers, to draw their readers in. Well, what are we going to do in an exhibition? So we thought that the story of Hebrew and Yiddish printing in this period would be the way to do it, because in a way those books were the most powerful expression. It was the ways in which all that knowledge, all that authority was expressed. It was expressed through books, through printing. So the story of printing, which is really a very international story coming from Venice and coming from Prague and coming to Lublin and to Krakow, that whole story, in Italy, that whole story of printing, we thought was the way to do it. And we want to engage the visitors, and you do that here. I mean, it's amazing, because I've seen your printing presses, and I've seen all those typefaces, and you give your visitors an opportunity to actually print. Well, we wanted our visitors to print too. So we created printing presses, and they are presses. You don't roll, you actually press in order to print. And we have them print, well, among other things, we have them print printer's marks, which are the logos, basically, of the printer, and also the title page of the Shulchan Aruch, basically Simon Luria's, his Code of Jewish Law, with the annotations of the great Rabbi Moses Isserles, considered the greatest Polish rabbi. And of course, we do want our visitors to have a look inside these books, and so we created a library. And although we're not able, obviously, and visitors wouldn't be able to decipher what's inside them, we were able to create some really, I think, clear interactives that would introduce visitors to contents of books they would not otherwise be able to read. And we divided the books into 4 big categories, one of which was Yiddish. And we were especially interested in the early, and some of the earliest Yiddish books were in fact printed in Poland, and we were wanting, and of course among them, among the very, very earliest are the ones that are intended specifically for women. And so we present them on the one hand as one of the 4 sections, and then also in the interactive stations, we give our visitors an opportunity. And I just love the way in which the booksellers are very direct in their appeal to the potential customer. Listen, dear esteemed pious women, take a look at this Yiddish book and read it, so that one shall place one's trust in God Almighty. And this is Rivka's Nurse, and it's 1609. So the books actually function here in a very, very particular way. They are, and I would say this, other exhibitions that deal with historical topics, broad Jewish historical topics, they often work thematically. They would, whatever else they did, they'd have a special section just about Yiddish, standalone, everything you wanted to know about Yiddish, the beginning, the middle, to the present. We decided not to do that. We decided that Yiddish was an integral part of the story, and we wanted to integrate it into the narration. And we wanted it always to be sitting contextually within a wider picture. And so this is a much more, I would say, more contextual approach, more integrated, and it is a way of saying that Yiddish is omnipresent in time and in space and in the story itself. So we come to the middle of the 17th century, the Khmelnytsky uprising, the devastation of the Jewish community. The 17th century is a century of war. The whole country is devastated. But the country starts to rebound at the end of the 17th century, and we now move to the second half of this big red map period. And in this part, we zoom in on everyday life and as it was lived in the so-called Jewish town. We don't use the word shtetl unless we're speaking Yiddish, because we want to, and we situate the story of the shtetl or the Jewish town in the 18th century, which is really when it really blossomed, because it became, in this territory, the most distinctive form of Jewish settlement. It really was, and it was defined by the presence, the exceptional proportion of the population of these towns. They were Jews. My father's town of Apatov, of Apt, was, during the interwar years, it was 60% of the population was Jewish. And there are other towns where the percentage was even higher, 60, 70, 80, 90% Jewish. And that presence, that mass presence of Jews in these towns gave these towns their very special character, but they also made it possible to develop an integral Jewish way of life. So where does Yiddish appear here? It appears in many places, but one of my favorites is it appears with a herring. Just a moment. Okay. So we have, as you can see here, we have a marketplace. There are two centers of gravity in the Jewish town gallery. One is the marketplace, economic life, interaction with the non-Jewish population, and the other is the synagogue and Jewish religious and communal life. So on this market table, we have a goose, and we talk about goose and goose fat and feathers and all the things to do with geese. But the fish, that's my favorite, is the fish. And why is it my favorite? It's my favorite because where it comes from, and that is a collection of medical advice in Yiddish, printed in Poland in 1613, and the problem was, is fish meat? This was a question. Is fish meat? If you don't know, you play it safe. And you don't eat it with meat, and in case it's meat, you play it safe, and you don't eat it with dairy. So, I mean, what's interesting is, when did fish become parv? When did it become neutral? Even to this day, very religious people will not mix fish and meat in the same dish, although they might have fish first and then later have meat. But actually chickens have the same problem, but we're not going to deal with chickens at the moment. But in any event, the idea that you have this, just even that you have a medical advice in Yiddish printed in Poland in 1613. And incidentally, it's a wonderful section in this exhibition on self-help books. You really have a look. They're absolutely fascinating. And of course, they have a long history. You have it even here. So this is what this is basically, it's from Sefer Derech Eitz HaChaim, and so it was a category of its own, and you don't eat it. Now, a great place for really presenting Yiddish, of course, is in the Jewish home, and it's around Jewish piety, and particularly tchinas, or Jewish supplicatory prayers, which we present, and we present not only these prayers, some of them actually are written for women, and some of them are written by women, and they're a wonderful resource. This is 1770. This is Trina Imre Shifra. And she actually, and these women were actually quite learned. And in this particular one, you can see the influence of the popularization of Kabbalah. But very special to me is Art Center Vienna, because I gave it to the museum. And David and I were talking yesterday, and I told him how I acquired it. And I will share that story with you. So when I first came to New York in 1970, Wolf Yunin, in 1972, Wolf Yunin, who was a writer for the Vorwärts, and he was a folklorist, and he was always collecting folklore, and he took me under his wing, and he said to me, Breindl, you have to form a Yiddish library. I said, okay. So what did Wolf Yunin do? He would read the obituaries, and he would see that a Yiddish writer died, and he'd call me up and he said, Breindl, we have an appointment. We're going to the Bronx, and we're going to visit the widow of so-and-so. And sure enough, I formed my Yiddish library from the libraries of Yiddish writers who had passed away, and their widows were trying to find a home for their books. And this is one of the books. It's an 18th century Center Vienna illustrated. And obviously the illustrations are taken from actually Christian books. They're from Christian Bibles. And they repeat. They don't even necessarily relate to the passage. But that's the Center Vienna. And I know that there are some wonderful Center Viennas there's a whole section on the Center Vienna in this exhibition. And so we also have a replica of an esrog, of an etrog, of a citron. Why? Because on the Center Vienna, if a pregnant woman wants to give birth to a child as easily as a hen laying eggs, the Center Vienna advises her to bite off the tip of the citron after it has served its purpose for Sukkot, and she should ask the Lord Almighty not to burden her with the sin committed by Eve, the first mother, and let her give birth painlessly to a healthy child. And so, because it was a citron, the etrog, not an apple, that was considered to be the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. So that was our Center Vienna. Now, these self-help books, we have them in Yiddish, not only in the 17th, also the 18th century. Michel Herzog wrote his master's thesis on this particular one, the Sefer Refuas. And what's so interesting about this one is that this is a medical doctor who wants to convince his Yiddish readers not to follow Bubamaisis, not to follow these quacks and this sort of, superstitions and folk remedies that actually would do more harm than good. And it was his attempt to, in a sense, educate this Yiddish and in Yiddish, so that the public he wanted to read it would be able to. Okay, so we move from the marketplace to the synagogue, and here we discover that Yiddish is appearing in these learned books. And in this Kav HaYashar, I found it fascinating that this popular text was first printed in a bilingual Hebrew and Yiddish edition. The idea being that there were men who were not literate or not comfortable or literate enough in Hebrew, as well as women, but also, this one is the best, and that is that here, and I think that in terms of defending the Yiddish language, it was already being defended internally in the 18th century. In our country, Yiddish is the language for everyone. Those who are educated should not think it's shameful to read holy books in Yiddish. Yes, and this is how Tzvi Hirsch Hotch spoke to his readers in Sefer Nahalat Tzvi, the Yiddish adaptation of narrative and ethical section of the Zohar, which appeared in Frankfurt in 1711. So I think that there was a kind of advocacy for using Yiddish for religious books and not only, and of course, moral instruction, etc. In between 1772 and 1795, that big red map was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And we tried to express the rapidity and dramatic nature of change in the period that followed, in the long 19th century. And we try to express this consciousness of change, not just what changed, but the ways in which change was so rapid and so dramatic that you have the beginning of a kind of flowering of autobiographies and memoirs, because people feel compelled to describe how different the world became from when they were a child to the point at which they're writing at the end of their lives. And one of the areas in which we do this most dramatically is in transformations of the Jewish wedding. And to give you a feeling for it, from this wonderful Yiddish memoir, Yiddish Zechronis, from Yecheskel Kotik. And what we try to do is to express what's going on in the words of somebody in the period who is experiencing what's happening. And so one of the ways in which they tried to avoid the draft was to either marry their children off at a very, very young age or to lie about their age. And in the case of Yecheskel Kotik, he really, really was an absolute child when they made this shidduch, and it was not a happy one. So, and he's a wonderful writer, and David Asaf has translated the memoirs, so if you want to read them in English, they are just brilliant. So, we now come to the emergence of modern Yiddish and Hebrew culture, and social and political movements, and in a sense, I would say that our small section here is like, how can I say, soup in a cup. Add hot water, and you have Yiddish, a global culture. That's how I'd put it. Well, we have a 1,000-year history to tell, and so some of the most beautiful stories that deserve much bigger treatment have been treated in a very compressed and very, very compact way. However, Peretz is right at the center, and his statement for me is everything. And that is, without Hebrew, the folk has no past, and without Yiddish, we have no folk. And this was a statement that was quoted in the press at the time of the 1908 Chernovitz Yiddish conference, and where there was the debate as to what should be the national language, the Jewish national language. Should it be Hebrew? Should it be Yiddish? Consummate diplomat, you have to have both, and here's why. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful statements. And so we, of course, come to the period of mass emigration, 1881 to World War I, and then to a trickle in 21 and 24 rather. And that, of course, is precisely as this immigration closes down that you have all this emigration to Western Europe, and you have this really incredible efflorescence in Berlin, in Paris, and you have letters from the emigres to their families, and this collection is phenomenal. This collection was discovered by accident because all these letters from Jewish emigres that were sort of waylaid in London, these letters came to Poland and they got stuck in the censor's office, and they never went to the people who were supposed to get them. And they were found relatively recently, and this one, I won't go into detail, but it even came with drawings, which was kind of amazing. And of course, you will see these wonderful books here in the exhibition, these Yud Lamed Peretz, incredibly beautiful volumes. I gave the museum these Goldfaden play scripts. I had salvaged them when the Hebrew Publishing Company was going out of business, and they had stacks of them in their warehouse. And of course, the story of the Yiddish press. We come to the interwar years, and that is the 1920s and 1930s. After World War I, the Second Polish Republic is established, and Poland is now an independent state after 120 plus years having been partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And we divide this period, this short, very vibrant period, into culture, politics, everyday life, and growing up. And under culture, of course, Vilna is at the very center of our story. And I think many of you will recognize the sentiment that Yiddish itself has been recognized as a territory. The idea that it's not that Yiddish occupies the globe, but rather that it is a territory unto itself. And it is an anarchic republic with its capital in Vilna. And of course, YIVO is the scholarly academy of the territory Yiddish. And it's here really that Yiddish comes forward, including the Sammler phenomenon. I mean, in the case of the Yiddish Book Center, people continue to send books, but in the case of YIVO, they really, I would say, they catalyzed, they energized a huge network of amateur collectors, and they also provided them with instructions how to collect Yiddish folklore. In fact, there's a section of this exhibition that talks about the Ansky expedition and the collecting of Yiddish folklore in this territory during the interwar years. But of course, the Yiddish literary scene, and we are inspired here by the Klamatsky 13, which was a gathering place for Yiddish writers and artists and musicians. And we take inspiration from this incredibly wonderful cartoon on Olympus with parrots looking down from Olympus. What kind of a literature is that? And Shalom Aleichem. No, Yiddish culture is being created. So we take our inspiration, we have the graphic on the wall, we have the gramophone, we have the music, but and you know, we obviously, these are all iconic images, you will find them also in the exhibition, but we have an interactive that is based on a map in the journal Literarische Blätter, and it is it is an expression of Yiddish as a global language and culture. It is a map of all the main places where you can find, where they're distributing Literarische Blätter. And then once you get this map, you can interact with it and learn more about what was in those issues and who the readers were and such. But the, I think, very special presentation is one that's inspired by a micrography or micrographia. And there's a great example in the exhibition, a great big, huge, enormous, unbelievable micrographic original here in the exhibition. But what we wanted to do was do something interactive. And so what did we do? We basically gave visitors the opportunity to select a writer from maybe 2, 4, 6, 8 writers, and to read their writing in Yiddish by pulling down this little translator magnifying glass. It would convert into English, and those Yiddish letters would then reconstitute themselves into a micrographic portrait of the writer. So it was a way to try to, well, the main thing was we wanted visitors to read an excerpt of their writing, and we wanted them to see the writing in Yiddish. And so we gave them the writing in Yiddish, and we gave them a little glass to pull it down to read it in English. And as they did it, the Yiddish migrated over here and formed a portrait. So that was the device that we used. And of course, the Yiddish press. But I think what I'm going to do in the interest of time, and so that you're able to ask some questions, I just want to conclude by saying that this story carries through from the interwar years into the period of the Holocaust, where we actually narrate the story through the Yiddish diary of Emanuel Ringelblum. We see Yiddish on the wall, and we contrast it with the Polish diary of Adam Cherniakow, who was the head of the Judenrat, and we bring the whole story forward and into the post-war period, the communist period, where the greatest center of Yiddish book publishing was in Buenos Aires, but the second biggest center of Yiddish book publishing was actually in Poland, not in New York, but in Poland. And we have a very beautiful way of presenting that. So it's a way of saying that Yiddish is global in many ways, that it forms its own territory, which is a kind of a co-territory. It is present in the world. It is global in its outlook and understanding of itself. It is international in the way in which translation brings literature into Yiddish, and and brings Yiddish into other languages. And so this sense of Yiddish as co-territorial, diasporic, international, that its, if you will, its global character is as much a feature of consciousness as it is a phenomenon in the world. And I think that it's a very powerful idea, and I think that this Yiddish Book Center and this exhibition has really made it is a first, and it is really a unique contribution to our understanding and appreciation of Yiddish culture and all that it represents. So there.
My question is, well, it's actually a statement also. If you go into the Hasidic community, Yiddish is spoken at home, and it's a daily language that has evolved. And, for example, I know I used to try to subscribe, which I did, to the newspaper The Yid, and it was very difficult reading and understanding words that were new words that the Hasidics use every day, but you can't even find in any dictionary. Are the universities that are teaching Yiddish evolving the same way as the Hasidim?
Really interesting, very interesting question. So, first of all, Yiddish has always evolved, and I don't think there's ever been a period when new words weren't introduced. So, I would say, well, okay, first of all, when Duolingo launched its Yiddish app, 250,000 people signed up. Now, I don't know how many people stayed with it, but some actually went from Duolingo to, the Yiddish summer program in Oxford and Tel Aviv and New York and Vilnius. And what was fascinating is that with Duolingo, you don't just read, you also hear Yiddish and you have to speak it. And they had to decide, what it going to be? Is it going to be YIVO Yiddish? Is it going to be WEVD, broadcast Yiddish? What kind of Yiddish is it going to be? And they decided they were going to make a Hasidic Yiddish. So basically Hungarian. And that it would be native speakers of that Yiddish, which was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. So that would be sort of one thing to think about. The second is that those secular Jews, not the Hasidim, the secular Jews who are dedicated to the vitality and of Yiddish as a spoken language today, and who are raising their kids speaking Yiddish today, have to and are actively developing a vocabulary for phenomena in our day that didn't exist when, even when Uriel Weinreich wrote his dictionary, let alone Max Weinreich. So I remember that, and I think that Mordechai Schechter's typewriter is here in the exhibition. And I remember once that, and he's a wonderful Yiddish teacher, and I remember studying with him in the Yiddish summer program in the late 60s. I remember he invited me to his home for lunch with his son and his daughters, and I remember sitting at the table, and they were having, everything's in Yiddish, of course, and they were having a conversation about baseball. I don't know why I found that surprising. But I thought, whoa, you can talk about anything in Yiddish. Anything. But here, this was, I would say, it was the introduction of neologisms speeded up to make up for lost time, so to speak. And that is that it was a concerted, deliberate, thoughtful, systematic, principled effort to create a vocabulary for speaking in Yiddish about contemporary things. So, I think, listen, the English language, the Oxford Dictionary is a good thing it's online, because they would never be able to keep it up printed. They're every year they're introducing new words. It's the nature of language, and Yiddish is no exception.
Yes, if I may. In the mid-90s, there was an effort in Montreal to revive Yiddish theater at the Sadie Bronfman Center, and Sadie's daughter, Phyllis Lambert, was a big motivator of that. And then I've lost touch with that. I wonder if you could tell us what has become of that, and if there's any remnants of it surviving.
It's a good question, and you're asking a Canadian, so I should know, but I'm from Toronto. So it's, So, unfortunately, I don't know, but I do know that there is a Yiddish theater in New York, the Volksbühne, which is a really legendary Yiddish theater with a long history, more than 100 years, and they had a very successful production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. And they've done some other productions in Yiddish, and in the case of Fiddler, even made it to Broadway. So, but that isn't really an answer. It's not an answer to your question, but what I would say is that there is Yiddish theater, but, considering what Yiddish theater once was, and you are surrounded here by what it once was. And it was, Yiddish theater was a passion, even an obsession among the Yiddish public, broad Yiddish public, and Yiddish theater of all kinds, whether it was Kunst, whether it was high theater, art theater, or whether it was popular theater. I don't think there's a Jewish public for theater of any kind that was as passionate and devoted and dedicated to theater as there was for Yiddish theater in its heyday, and not only in Poland, but certainly in immigrant Jewish communities around the world, and of course especially in the largest of them in New York. So it's really, today, very, very limited, but what there is, I think, is to really be treasured and really important.
Hi, I was wondering about the, looking at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and how it got divided and everything. I just think back to, my grandparents speak in Yiddish, but they speak in, different, kinds of Yiddish from different places, and I wonder about, people from Galicia or whatever, in Austria, right, all of that, when Poland gets reunified, do those dialects kind of go away, because
Okay.
I just wonder about the history of those dialects being changing as the borders change.
Okay, so it's a very good question. There is a map in this exhibition, in a section that deals with preserving Jewish heritage and looks at different collecting efforts. There's one map there that I really recommend that you have a look at. And it is a map from a project called the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. It was an incredible project that was organized by Uriel Weinreich in the 60s. And then after his premature and tragic death, it was carried on by Michel Herzog. Now, it is really the answer to, in many ways, it's the answer to your question. And that is, basically, Uriel Weinreich wanted to understand the regional nature of Yiddish across what he thought of as the Ashkenazic culture area, which went from Alsace to Smolensk and from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Big, huge area. He divided the whole area into quadrants, and he had a big team, and the idea was to find native speakers from every single quadrant to cover the whole territory. And of course, for some quadrants, there was no native speaker had survived. But to find native speakers and people who had, so that was the idea. They created a questionnaire with over 2,000 questions, and they, very sophisticated, and they recorded these answers, and they then mapped them. And so they were able to actually identify regions, and they could also show that where you had these variations in language, you also had variations in culture. So they actually also collected, for my favorites, did you consider mushrooms poisonous? Was one of the questions. Did you consider tomato? You might want to know why. I'll tell you why. Did you consider tomatoes poisonous? Where did they consider it poisonous? Where not? How did you make farfel? Did you pinch it? Did you chop it? Did you grate it? What did you call? I'm trying to think. Challah. Do you call it barches? What did you call whatever? They might show them they showed them pictures of vegetables, pictures of fruit, and said, "What did you call it?" So, you want to know about tomatoes and mushrooms? I know. So I'll explain. So with mushrooms, it's the same problem as with fish. What is it? It's the same problem. Is it it's not a fruit, it's not a vegetable, and it's meaty, and it's brown, and it's meaty. No. So for some, and it wasn't like you didn't know which ones were, because mushrooms and mushroom picking was like a big deal. What about tomatoes? So the problem with tomatoes, well, for my grandmother, it was because they grew in the priest's garden. But for the atlas, the answer was different, because when you cut them in half, there's a cross inside. Or when you cut them in half, they're bloody. So, but in any event, these are not universal. They're regional, and they were able to correlate the regional distribution of answers to cultural questions with regional distribution to pronunciation and vocabulary and that kind of thing. Is a map that shows how they did it in this exhibition. So I almost included it, but that's for another time. But in any event, I would say this. There are two, if you will, tensions. One is towards the preservation, or if you will, the valuing of regional forms of Yiddish. As part of the legacy is that Yiddish has these regional forms, and not just regional. There are differences in gender, in class. The variation isn't just where you lived and that kind of language, but the other is towards the standardization of the language. And you'll see that, I know that David's planning for I hope I'm not giving anything away, but for the introductory gallery, he is planning a huge installation of just dictionaries. And dictionaries that is Yiddish on display like to the nth degree. That is a language displaying itself, is in the form of dictionaries. Now, dictionaries, for example, the modern English-Yiddish dictionary that Weinreich created, and his College Yiddish textbook, and YIVO, and I don't know, did anybody here see the Great Yiddish Dictionary performance in New York that Alex, oh my God, it's just, okay, it's later. But in any event, what's fantastic is that Max Weinreich felt that for Yiddish to be a proper language, it should have rules. I mean, it does have rules, but the rules should be standardized. So he really wanted to create a kind of standardized Yiddish, and that meant textbook, dictionary, rules. And then you had Mordechai Schechter, and you had Yudel Mark, and you had others who had a much more flexible and more open feeling about the language. So the short answer to your question is that, yes, the regional forms of Yiddish persisted in the interwar years, continue to this day, at the same time that there is also a movement to create a standard language, a language that would be like for the radio, for the press, and because it was felt that every other national language had standards. So, that would be, so the answer is yes.
Thank you, and thanks for the wonderful presentation. My question is about education. So the slide that I enjoyed the most was the one from, I believe, 1609 with the publisher's note saying, "Hey, Jewish woman, you should check out this book."
Yeah.
So to what extent could Yiddish speakers read and write Yiddish? And especially to what extent could Yiddish women read and write in Yiddish?
So I don't know if I don't know if I'm correct on this, and somebody, maybe Sam, can correct me if I'm wrong, and that is that Seneverena, which is a book that was created for and read by women in Yiddish, and it would be, and the woman, the mother might read it aloud because it had wonderful stories in it, like to the kids on Shabbos. It was, if not the most widely published Yiddish book, one of them. Sam, is it the most widely published Yiddish book, Seneverena? So,
And on Saturdays, there would be a Zuckerke in the women's section who would read the emotional parts and get them to cry. And then down they would beat on the stender and say, shot. And yeah, so the center is very...
so I think, I mean, for me, I take that as an indication, and I think that Sam's comment about the Zuckerke, which is a woman who had no problem with Yiddish, who might read on behalf of women who either couldn't read or read with difficulty. But we know that we have, in the early modern period, as we could see from, as we can see from Trines, from these prayers, but also from other sources, that that women were, some of these women were reading not only Yiddish but also Hebrew. So I'm not saying that all women, but if you have that many editions of the Tzena Verena, which is still to this day being printed and being published and being read, it means that there's a greater degree of Yiddish literacy in this early modern period than we might expect. So as to whether or not they could write Yiddish is another story, because we do have Yiddish letters from women, 17th century for sure, possibly earlier. So I think that we can rest assured you couldn't have that many books and for that long if they didn't. Just another change of pace here. Okay.
Okay. Barbara, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think, obviously, we could have probably gone on for hours listening to Barbara. I think it's certainly inspiring to go see the POLIN exhibit in person and learn more about everything that she and Sam and others did in Poland. Obviously, of course, if you haven't, we hope you'll explore our exhibit here, Yiddish, A Global Culture. And I, personally am really interested in exploring this topic of how we get other Jewish museums, other Holocaust museums, and other non-Jewish museums to display more Yiddish language and culture in these various contexts, given how central Yiddish has been globally. I think there's a time to really bring this into a broader context overall. So I want to thank Barbara again, and I want to let everybody know that David Mazower will be signing the gloriously beautiful catalog of this exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture. If you hadn't seen the catalog, you have to check it out. And he will be up there signing it, so you have a unique opportunity to get your personal copy, and I hope you'll do so. And I want to thank everyone for being here today, and thank everyone online for listening. And I hope we'll bring Barbara back again and hear more of her fascinating stories. So thank you all.